everybody. Welcome to this Grand Rounds. Before we introduce our speaker today, there are some housekeeping items as always. This Grand Rounds will be video conferenced and videotaped. We're webcasting live with a live stream to Facebook and YouTube. Everybody who has a question at the end of it, please use microphones to ask the question so we can record that also. The webcast is always available for viewing at a later time also, so for those who don't have time to see it all today, you can always catch up later. Please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel to get notifications about new videos as we add content. We will be broadcasting this Grand Rounds talk today with Dr. Vial, and we'll have an interview following that we'll also be broadcasting afterwards. We have a couple of conferences coming up from Mighty. The first one being the 10th annual Multi-Modality Cardiovascular Imaging for the Clinicians meeting that will be held March 14 and 16. It's a fantastic conference at really state-of-the-art cardiovascular imaging will be highlighted and discussed. Then we have the 11th Annual Re-Evolution Summit. It's our meeting for minimal invasive cardiac surgery, also a fantastic meeting for all those of you who are interested in learning minimal invasive techniques for cardiovascular surgery. And then finally, we have the 5th Annual Houston Methodist CMR meeting. I suspect that CMR stands for Cardiac MR. Excellent. I get a yes, a nod. Fantastic. So certainly also a meeting that's going to be fantastic with our experts here from Houston Methodist. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Grand Round speaker today. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Conrad Vial. Dr. Vial is a practicing cardiothoracic surgeon who has worked at various leadership positions in a multi-specialty medical group, the Sutter Health Group, which is an integrated healthcare delivery system. He now serves as the Senior Vice President and the Chief Clinical Officer for Sutter Health, the 7th largest non-for-profit healthcare delivery system in the United States. Sutter Health serves over 3 million patients in Northern California with 12,000 aligned physicians working across the continuum of care. In his leadership role, Dr. Vial is responsible for development of clinical strategy, research, graduate medical education, quality and safety, digital patient engagement, patient experience, and clinical operational integration, including variation reduction and interdisciplinary service line development. From the clinical practice perspective, Dr. Vial is a practicing cardiac surgeon with a particular interest in structural heart disease, focusing on minimal invasive cardiothoracic surgery and catheter-based valve repair and replacement. He received his bachelor's degree and medical doctorate from Stanford University. In addition, he has spent time in the UK and earned a Doctor of Philosophy at Cambridge University in England, while also completing a postdoc there in transplant immunology. He received his general surgical and cardiothoracic surgical training at Stanford University Medical Center. Dr. Vial and his wife, Catalina, are celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary, so congratulations on that. And they live in Woodside, California with their 3 sons. So thank you very much, Dr. Vial. I'm very excited about your talk this morning.
Thanks. Good morning to you all. You know, it's always a pleasure to be invited to exchange ideas with esteemed colleagues, but it's humbling to come to an environment like this one that is so rich in heritage and achievement and be asked to share some thoughts. So I want to start before going into my talk with my expression of sincere gratitude for the opportunity to come here and be with you. I have to say that in preparing for this opportunity and in configuring the talk, I spent a little time outside myself looking at the talk at the end of it and thinking, this is a little strange, it's a little risky. The central thesis or the thrust of it is straightforward enough, I believe. The idea is we've done something, we the cardiovascular community have done something very remarkable in the recent past, in multiple sectors, but in particular I would highlight in the area of structural heart disease management. Some really important new technology has been evaluated in a particularly rigorous way and has demonstrated tremendous benefit for patients. And that revolution is ongoing. The part of it that to me calls out for maybe deeper reflection is not so much what has been achieved, but how it has been achieved, and in particularly looking at the role of interdisciplinary, team-based care and shared learning and shared decision-making in helping to make this possible. I think it's important for us to pause for a moment and understand the underpinnings of that success. Why is it that has been and is still being as revolutionary in its impact and its scope as it is? And the reason for that is because I think cardiovascular specialists who've engaged in this have the opportunity to scale this, not only for the betterment of cardiovascular care integration across the spectrum of cardiovascular specialties, but truly to the rest of healthcare, because our system is very much in need of that. The living lab that I have some experience with and the teams that I have the honor to have been a part of and continue to work with come from a particular place. It's a different place than this and different place than many others, and yet shares a lot of common ground. I'd like to take just a few moments to acquaint you with my home institution, because I'll be coming back to some of the things that we've been doing later on in the talk, and would like you to have some baseline knowledge about Sutter Health. Sutter Health, as was said in your very kind introduction, Moritz, is Northern California based. It has a relatively large footprint, although I'm recalculating and recalibrating what I mean by a large footprint, having toured your facility here. At any rate, the scope of it is perhaps impressive, but what is more, to me, impressive is the diversity of the populations and the communities that are served. In this part of the world, in Northern California, and within the footprint of Sutter Health, you will find the second and third most densely populated urbanized areas in the country, in San Francisco, Oakland, and in San Jose. You will find also in this footprint some of the most sparsely populated areas. You'll find the second and third richest zip codes in the United States, in the heart of Silicon Valley. You'll also find the poorest county in the state of California. You'll find the seat of our state government, and you'll find the centers of the high-tech industry, or a center at least of it, and big agricultural industrial presences that have not only statewide but national import. So this is an area that has some complexity to it and has some diversity to it, and that redounds, I think, to the benefit of our system in terms of being challenged and being stretched. But the challenge is a great one. We need a large team and a highly effective team in order to do this. The team requires a lot of support, not all of it financial, but certainly that's a part of it. And if you're going to endow people with the infrastructure, the tools, and the technologies to perform to the utmost with their skills, that's going to take some investment. A day in the life at Sutter Health is a busy day. That's not unique. Healthcare is a busy business in lots of places. But I think what's important is that in our community, because of the diversity that I've described, or the spectrum of communities that we serve, there's a great deal of unmet need. And we are the largest provider of fee-for-service Medicare and Medicaid services in our part of the world. And that requires us to be prepared to follow through on our mission in a number of different ways, including providing care which is partially or entirely uncompensated. And this is not a trivial matter. Having said that, we, like most organizations, have articulated a mission, vision, and values. And we've got strategic pillars that are meant to support outputs that we feel best serve the communities who trust us with their care. These outputs are not dissimilar from the outputs that I think many in healthcare are looking for. I think a deeper point, maybe a philosophical point, is that if you look at the output of safe care or that of personal, affordable, and accessible care, the reality is that what comes into view with even just a little bit of reflection is the fact that we're not widget makers. We provide a product and a service that goes to the very core of humanity. And the medium through which we transmit those products and those services is fundamentally relationship-centric. The building blocks of any great relationship are the same outputs that we want to see from healthcare, not only in our system, but I would argue all of us, if we take a moment, would aspire to the same thing for the entire healthcare system in our country. This is an important point because when we read or we reflect on insufficiencies or gaps in healthcare delivery, they often come at the expense of the quality of relationships. Relationships between a caregiving team and the patients who get served, and relationships within a caregiving team. One of the most patient-centric things we've learned, and there's tremendous data now to attest, one of the most patient-centric things that you can do is to actually spend a little time looking at the other side of that relationship equation, focusing on removing friction, reducing barriers to the delivery of care at the level of helping those who have dedicated their lives to deliver that care be able to do so more efficiently and with more effective support. That translates into a patient benefit because that relationship medium is enhanced by that. Yet we get into our own way much of the time. And so the objectives that I have for today are to step a little bit outside of what is comfortable for us, of what we know, of what we do every day, not because it's not important, but because some of the things that have been most successful, and I'll refer back to the notion of interdisciplinary team-based evaluation of patients, selection of patients, that has been mandated in a narrow sliver of what we do, but really has benefit overarching. That mandate is one that we need to look to grow. We need to look to scale. But we need to understand why it ought to be a mandate in the first place, and I think there are fields outside of medicine that can help us to understand that, and frankly, outside of the business of medicine as well. So the overarching problem is not alien to you at all. You live it every day. I think we all do. Healthcare, regardless of the political discourse that surrounds it, particularly in this season, is thought of as a worthy and noble cause for an individual to be involved in. It's thought of, I think appropriately, as a worthy investment at a societal level. And yet, there's tremendous waste, there's tremendous inefficiency in healthcare. And as I say, it touches us pretty much every day. There's a mandate for innovation to overcome this inefficiency, to reduce waste, to, as I said before, remove friction. And yet, we are often launching so-called innovations in ways that outstrip our ability, or frankly, in many instances, our commitment to truly understand what the value of a given so-called innovation is, and how that value can best be expressed by a way of deploying it that needs to be bounded, that needs to be understood from not one, but multiple perspectives. We have things that fly in the face of that, which include fundamentally the way we're reimbursed and the way we're paid. And that's a big conversation that we'll touch a little bit on perhaps today, but certainly not going to solve in the forthcoming 45 minutes. That said, it's been suggested that healthcare would do well to get outside of itself in ways that lead it to adopt, if you will, in fairly wholesale fashion, what I'm going to call toolkits. You could think of them as methodologies that have come out of the manufacturing sector. Now, leaving aside for a moment whether a wholesale implementation of a manufacturing methodology for improving efficiency, whether or not that actually makes entire sense in a relationship-centric service endeavor, is not an argument I want to get into. I want to stipulate that there are beneficial aspects of what is called the lean methodology or Six Sigma or the Toyota production method or however you've come upon that body of work. The reality, though, is that that benefit is rooted in a fundamental fact, which is if you're trying to improve, no matter what it is that you're doing, that improvement is based on being able to design and ultimately build a bridge that extends between an ostensibly unsatisfactory current state and a more desirable future state. This is just fundamental common sense. The question, though, is what kind of a mindset that you have to have. Set aside your toolkit for a second. Set aside even your skill set. What kind of a mindset do you have to bring to this bridge building effort? I think it's a mindset that has to, as honestly as possible, as ruthlessly, honestly as possible, characterize what your real current state is so that you can understand how far off you are from the future state, assuming that you understand what that future state should be. Only then will you be able to amass the materials and bring together the right technology to be able to build the right bridge between those two. And by the way, this isn't one bridge. We're constantly building that bridge. It's an iterative, unending process. So I'd like to pause for a second to talk a little bit about what can help us understand the real gap between a current state and a future state, and how do we then use that understanding, translate it into better bridge building. Well, over the holidays, I was having a conversation with my eldest son, Marcello, and he's a double major in philosophy and psychology, setting aside what he's going to do with that in the future. It makes for interesting conversation. I'm interested in what he reads. I'm interested in his telling of what he's learned. And he turned me on to something that at first blush I didn't entirely understand, but it caught my attention enough to make me ruminate a bit on it. And ultimately, I found it useful as a way of thinking about some of the ideas that I'm wanting to share with you this morning. In particular, he shared this study with me. It comes from a field called cultural psychology, really about the way in which a cultural or general mindset and an individual mindset are mutually reinforced or even co-constructed. The idea of the study here was to look at how somebody's pattern or the nature of their particular self-awareness influences how they appraise themselves, and how that self-awareness is biased by the way in which they're brought up. And without getting into a lot of the details of the study itself, although I recommend it to you because it's interesting reading, the findings of the study were basically that individuals or members of the experimental cohort that were brought up in an individualist culture, where the sense of self really comes out of internal markers, internal reference points, as opposed to having a sense of self that is in some way importantly modified by how others see you or how you perceive that others might see you. This had an important effect on how people rated themselves and the differential between how they see themselves actually and how they would like to be seen by others. And the difference here was made in this cohort of subjects that came up in an individualist culture was really made by whether or not that appraisal that I just went through according to those two criteria was done while looking in the mirror or not. When individuals appraise the difference between how they see themselves as they actually are and how they would like others to see them, there was a very small differential between those two. The act of merely looking in the mirror to undertake the same exercise of rating yourself according to how you'd like to be seen versus how you feel that you are, very much changed the criticality of that appraisal. The self-critical nature, the more self-critical nature, the gap that opened up between the two criteria when one was looking in the mirror, I think tells us something. It tells us something that actually my father used to tell me all the time when I was growing up. My dad's a professional coach, and he talk about mutual construction. His parenting style and his coaching style were definitely mutually constructed. And he used to talk all the time, knowing nothing about this body of work or any experimental science around it, about the importance of looking in the mirror. If you want to be an effective teammate, son, you've got to be able to look yourself in the mirror. You have to have the courage to look yourself in the mirror every day and ask yourself, am I doing all that I can be doing for this team and for this effort? And if you're going to build a team, and certainly if you're going to lead a team, you not only have to do that on a regular basis for yourself, you've got to call the team around you and have the entire team look at itself in the mirror in order to how to go forward. This is the essence of leadership. I'm going to relate this to the interdisciplinary heart team paradigm in just a moment, but the idea that I think is in this study is that the role of leadership, the role of team building, is to get ourselves into a place where we can more objectively appraise ourselves and our circumstance, where we can more objectively, or in a more truth-telling way, really give ourselves the brutal description of what our current state is, of all of our insufficiencies and gaps, and what it's going to take to get us to that place of performance that we want to be, that we want others to look upon us and see. If you do that, the mirror not only becomes a reflecting surface, it actually can be transfigured into a window onto the path forward, a path that's actually going to get you there. And I think that this has been really, really important for me to reflect on, because the title of the study was Mirrors in the Head, but I actually think that the success behind what many have described as the transcatheter structural heart disease management revolution, with TAVR and MitraClip and everything else that's coming down the pike, the secret has not only been the devices themselves and the engineering know-how and the passion that went in to creating the what around that work. It's really been about the inclusiveness and the discipline around the how that work is accomplished. This invokes another concept from another field, which is the idea that there are artifacts and there are interventions that can be and must be the product, dual products, complementary products of design thinking, which has been having a moment of late, for good reasons. Tim Brown, who's the CEO, has worked as the CEO of IDEO, which is a Palo Alto-based design consultancy firm, amongst other things, has written extensively with multiple partners about this, has written books and has written articles, including some that have been published in the Harvard Business Review. The notion is that we often focus on a what. We focus on the bright and shiny new object, the piece of technology that's going to change everything for us. And recently, it's been something like the stented valve prostheses. But concurrent with that, we've been talking a lot about augmented intelligence and machine-based learning and how the digitization of healthcare will revolutionize what I've said before was fundamentally a relationship service. The reality is it's important to push innovation in this direction, and you have to have a what in order to iterate on in some way. But how you do it has been fundamentally changed in our most recent experience, and I think it's actually a beacon of light for the whole of healthcare. We have important leaders who've embraced new technologies, who've courageously broken ranks with their tribes, if you will, and helped to assess rigorously the merits of a new technology. We've got places where that assessment has been enabled because of the infrastructure investments, because of the dedication to the latest and greatest and best tools and technologies to endow folks with lots of skill with. We've also got teams that have come together, and these teams have historically been ones that we've relied upon to perform procedures or interventions once they have been elected and patients have been selected. But the reality is that what is most valuable about what we've currently been going through is the idea that we're going to use very purposefully and in, frankly, not only a disciplined but a mandated fashion, an interdisciplinary approach to the evaluation of patients so that we can get ourselves out of the vulnerability of a subjective analysis based on an individual coming up through an individual cultural development. We're all trained that way, and there's good aspects to that, And I'll return to that concept in just a moment. Certainly I was trained, as many in this room, in my particular training, both as a general surgery resident and as a cardiothoracic surgical fellow, was one that very much emphasized the individual accountability and the individual ownership of a patient or of a service. And there is absolutely no reason and no way we can afford to lose that. But we need to scale that up differently. And I believe the interdisciplinary heart team concept that has held most dramatic sway recently in the work in evaluating transcatheter technologies really is something that we could scale upwards, and in so doing, benefit and have patients benefit and systems benefit from a more objective self-awareness driving a set of performance standards that go beyond individual production. So with those ideas in mind, let me come back to where we are, or where we've been, and where we are and where we want to be going at Sutter Health. Sutter, as I mentioned before, has a large footprint with the diversity and complexity that I tried to outline for you. We have a number of very highly skilled, dedicated, successful teams that have historically worked in places within this footprint. And they have worked largely in isolation because in many ways our system has permitted that by fundamentally not getting to a place of systemness that is as enriched as we might like. In other words, if you put Sutter Health up in front of a mirror and you look at what comes back is we have had numerous teams marching nominally under the same banner, each trying to be everything and anything it could be for the community that it served, for the geography that it was in, and in the process, optimized parts while sub-optimizing the whole. Not intentionally, not nefariously, but it is a definitely concrete effect of that approach, of essentially allowing within our footprint individualist cultures to hold sway to an extreme which is unreasonable. Unreasonable when you look at it from which vantage point? From the vantage point of the patient who walks into one of our doors in Santa Clara County and would like to be able to trust that they are receiving the benefits of an intelligence spread that draws on the resources and is enriched by the intellect and the commitment of the entire system and everybody who's in it. So the question then is, can we focus less on what we're doing in places, and can we start talking about how we can share and how we can integrate horizontally across our spaces? Because if we don't, what is the real value of an integrated healthcare delivery system? Put another way, how integrated is the integrated healthcare delivery system if that's the way things go? So the future state is to get to a place where we're more integrated. Well, we can take a lesson from the body on this. Because as Sutter and other healthcare systems are a body political, a body economic, a body cultural, our body gives us some instruction around this. If you ask the average person walking down the street, layperson, what the central nervous system is, most people will focus on the brain. And it's natural. But the reality is a brain disconnected from the outside world because of a spinal cord injury loses, in some instances, the ability for purposeful, reflexive, efficient action, and loses the ability to take in and ultimately push out information in a way that engages at a higher level. Well, an organization like Sutter Health is no different. When you ask the average person within Sutter Health where Sutter Health's brain is, you might get an answer that relates to some location where a group of administrative leaders or perhaps even clinical leaders sit on a regular basis. The headquarters of our company is in Sacramento, but the Sutter Health Bay Area Operating Unit's headquarters is in Emeryville. So depending on who you're asking and where they sit, they might refer to one place or the other, or they might refer to the 7th floor administrative suite of their hospital where they do most of their work. The reality is that those may be brains, but the real question around integration, around sharing across spaces and really proving the value of integrated healthcare run at proper scale is about the spinal cord. What does that spinal cord of an organization or a culture look like? Well, we made a very purposeful attempt at defining that through our teams and with our team. And switching up metaphors on you a little bit, that spinal cord looks like a chain of connectedness, of connectivity between the integrated healthcare delivery system, my home, in this case, Sutter Health, and its customers. I use the term customers in a very purposeful fashion, because the truth of the matter is we minister to patients, to families, to communities, but then there are other entities within and across those communities that pay for that healthcare. There's self-funded employers. There are private insurers. There's the government. And so it's important to acknowledge that. This chain, like any other chain, is only as strong as its weakest link. And it also has to be forged in a particular order. In my view, if you're going to build a strong spinal cord for true integrated healthcare, you've got to begin, obviously, with people and vision. People who are disciplined and who are called to and answer the call to embrace a culture of interdisciplinary team-based care, shared learning, and shared decision-making as the focus. Not that individual action isn't important and individual accountability isn't important, but it is offered up in a way that drives collective action. If I come back to my dad, he loved to quote John Wooden, and he loved to quote Vince Lombardi. He would say that Coach Wooden taught us that people don't learn what you teach, they learn what you emphasize. And being a good leader and being a good team builder is about emphasizing the right things in the right way. And he loved Coach Lombardi's definition of a team, which is individual initiative put at the service of collective goal. So you need those people. Without those people, nothing can happen. But those people need tools. And we are, in many instances, underinvested or paradoxically, I'll say misinvested. I think I just invented that word. But in analytical tools and decision support technologies that either don't talk to one another, don't actually close the gap that they're meant to close, or don't permit sufficient efficiency of engagement on the part of caregiving teams to actually be useful to patients. But if you can get those decision support technologies and analytics lined up, you can then create meaningful dashboards and performance metrics. You can have objectives that will actually move the needle. In other words, you can actually begin to assemble the materials necessary to build that bridge between the undesirable current state and the more desirable future state, assuming you've characterized those as objectively as you possibly can. A place where people get tripped up a lot, and I'll come back to this, is in the area of structural alignment. Alignment of incentives, alignment of reporting relationships, alignment of expectations even. Without those, even inspired people committed to a sound vision with the right tools, pursuing the right performance metrics, will not get there. And we have a major problem with this in our system writ large. We expect performance. We know that patients benefit more from performance, but we reimburse productivity. And there is a coming change in this, and that change is being driven by fundamentals that there's a lot of fairly simple math around in this country and in our states and in our communities. But being reactive or being a passive recipient of the change, of the so-called shift to value, or what I prefer to refer to as the shift to performance, is not going to be a way to actually get it done and get it done well. The way to get it done and get it done well is to recognize the all-important role of compelling clinical leadership in this. In other words, we have to disrupt ourselves, because being disrupted will not lead to the best possible outcome for a number of different reasons. Well, if you've got this alignment, you can actually produce some results that are worth communicating. I can't tell you the number of times that I am approached, or that early on in my career, even I succumbed to the temptation of saying, well, you know, let's just put a billboard up, or let's produce some glossy brochures about what we do, or how many times we did it last year or in the last decade. The answer is around what's worth communicating, and what's worth communicating are our results, our outcomes, on multiple lines, not just in terms of clinical outcomes, but in terms of the right definition of quality, a definition of quality that isn't alien to or separated from efficiency. The idea that something like a supply chain management initiative might actually be a part of clinical quality, not only because of the variation and reduction that it brings about, but because that variation and reduction realizes, at least in the not-for-profit world, savings that are able to be reinvested. The work of integrated healthcare delivery is not adjusting FTEs based on how the economic and market force winds are blowing. We need those bedside nurses. We need those PAs. We need those patient services representatives and medical assistants, and yet we need to be able to provide them competitive wages and an enriched culture that is fulfilling for them to practice within. If we're wasting money right, left, and center on stuff that we could take care of if we just adopted the right disciplines and focused on the performance metrics that are meaningful, we could keep those people. And the patients need them. And the doctors and the nurses need each other. Finally, if you do all this, you'll produce what I call brand equity. Now, I don't intend this as some kind of fancy-dancy MBA term. This is a real simple concept for me. It's really relationship equity, probably a better way to describe it. It's the simple concept that more people tomorrow are motivated to entrust us with their care than did yesterday, based upon what we can show them we're doing today, every day, based on the bridge building that we're doing, based upon the honesty of what our current state is and our appraisal of what the desirable future state would be. So this is, for me, what every service line needs to look like. And quite literally, when I work with members of our team and we communicate about problems that we're assessing within not just the cardiovascular service line, but a neuroscience service line, oncology, more service lines that we would build in the musculoskeletal, palliative care, it doesn't matter. We talk about it in terms of, are we dealing with a link 1 problem or a link 3 problem or a link 5 problem? It's just become a lexicon that we use. And so I want to dive into kind of a reverse engineering of this a little bit, and then a forward engineering view on what we're doing with this. Let's think about brand equity. I talked about brand equity being basically earned interest on the part of customers of all kinds. Well, one of those is those who would want to engage the strength of our teams to help push forward important clinical research efforts. Now, you'll recall the map that I showed of Sutter Health before, and you'll recall this idea of pockets of really intense skill being elaborated in relative isolation from one another. So working within size but not achieving scale. Well, our prior clinical trial engagements in the structural health space, structural heart disease management space, were several, but they were fragmented and isolated from one another largely. We had teams working in different parts of our footprint and being enrolling sites for the cascade of MitraClip trials, for the cascade of core valve trials, and the cascade of SAPIEN trials. And that was a fulfilling experience for those who were involved, but ultimately the ability to contribute to that effort that our system brought forward was suboptimized by the dynamics that I referred to earlier. This chain link concept comes forward, and we begin to try and be purposeful about how we're designing for a system that is internally cogent and coherent and mutually supporting, by getting people to recognize that not everybody can be everything to everybody else, that we've got to work together in a form of teamsmanship that speaks to emerging technology and the way, not just the what's around that emerging technology, but the how best to do it. And so we've organized ourselves in ways that are quite literal and quite specific. And we've begun to look at recommendations around what a level 1 center versus a level 2 center in structural heart disease management should be. And we've looked at our portfolio and made some determinations together, but in a disciplined fashion, about where our level 1 centers will be, which necessarily have advanced heart failure capabilities and interventions occurring and where our level 2 centers will be. And we are able to achieve an interconnectedness that was simply not ever achieved prior to this by simply articulating what the real mission was in the terms that I've tried to share with you here today. What that has led to is a really expanded, unified, ultimately more beneficial and more fulfilling engagement with one customer sector, which is, again, the clinical research sector. So if you compare the experience that we're rolling forward now in clinical research in our system versus what it was before, you can see from the list that I've put here, which is a partial list of what we're involved in, that we've got many more people engaged. We've got many more studies and protocols that we are pursuing. But the real reason for that is not the great personage hypothesis. It's the great team hypothesis. It's coming together purposefully in a way that has been different than what we've done before. Well, can this apply to other things? Can we scale this approach beyond the experience that I've relied so heavily on in this talk to this point, which is the structural heart disease experience? And the answer is yes, but it's only yes if we can get past what I think is almost always the weakest link in the chain, which is the one that is labeled in our system link 4, which is structural alignment. It's not just about how people are paid. It's how they are expected and incentivized to work together. Now, historically, at a singular hospital level, the way that that has unfolded has been through, in our part of the world at least, through individual medical directorships. A particularly noteworthy talent, a physician who is looked upon as a key opinion leader, is asked to take up an individual medical directorship and contracted to do so. And it is a role typically that trades in the currency of influence. And because it is individual, and because it is what I would describe as very process rather than performance-oriented, it's very, did you go to this meeting? Did you contribute to this database? Did you? So, yes, I went to this meeting. Here's the time card, and the compensation flows based on the contract appropriately and compliantly. But in the end, I'm not sure that we've really gotten a return on those investments that's been worth a lot. So a few years ago, when I was on the medical group side of leadership principally or exclusively, I brought or I joined with a group of 6 colleagues who represented multiple different subspecialties in the area of cardiovascular disease management and said, can't we come together and can't we bring everybody, which in that particular local hospital community was 26 practitioners, can't we bring ourselves together? We're different subspecialties. We are different business. We have different business modeling affiliations. Some of us are Sutter Health Foundation aligned. Some of us are independent and Independent Practice Association aligned. And we're going to continue to compete in the marketplace because that's not only appropriate, it's actually beneficial. But there's some things that we have in common. There's some performance that we can only do together. Can we find a way to come together to do that? So we established a limited liability corporation that included all 26 practitioners, working as a vehicle for contracting, ultimate revenue intake and revenue distribution that was focused completely and exclusively on improvements in access, quality, safety, educational program development, inclusive of clinical research work, and community outreach. This was not about referral volume, and it can't be about it from a legal perspective. So I want to emphasize that strongly. This was successful at this one institution, and yet, as you saw, we have 24 institutions in our organization, and within the Bay Area, there are 9 that are doing countable amounts of cardiovascular work. And the concept was, well, how do we take this and scale it? And the idea was, let's not do it one by one and then put them all together as a linear sum of parts. Let's just go directly to the entirety of our Bay Area operating unit. And let's expand the membership of this limited liability corporation from 26 to 100 cardiovascular practitioners, working across all these spaces, serving all the communities that you see highlighted here. And so as of a year ago, all individual cardiovascular medical directorships across this entirety, across the entirety of our operating unit in the Bay Area. All of those were abolished. And they were all put into and added to additional investment that came forward in the form of compensation flowing on the basis of a clearly articulated, legally crafted, and compliantly executed upon contract for services across the entirety of this space. We are now doing it in other areas. The North Valley section of our operating unit there is taking that on. This comprises, as you can tell, all but one of our level 1 or level 2 structural heart disease management locations, and the one that is in the South Valley will be coming into this arrangement in future as well. So that's great, Conrad. You're thinking, what's the point? What has this netted you? Has it just helped you rationalize your approach to transcatheter-based methodologies of structural heart disease management, or has it helped in the advanced heart failure or EP space, or what is it all about? Well, I'm going to choose 2 things out of the 15 performance metrics to illustrate to you as I wrap up here where we've gone with this. The idea is to identify targets of performance that have meaningful import for patients and communities, as well as our ability to be self-sustaining and to deserve our growth as a system. This comes down to understanding opportunity costs, understanding what happens when you have a patient who is in one facility languishing, is the verb I'll use, on a ventilator post-CABG when they need not be. And it's not because anybody wants to leave a patient to language, but it's because we have, across a system as big as ours, undesirable and wasteful clinical variation. And that clinical variation has import principally for patients, their experience and their outcomes, but also from a cost perspective. It impacts our efficiency, which impacts our ability to reinvest in our not-for-profit mission in ways that are not only self-sustaining, but can promote deserved growth. Well, you got to have the analytics in place to be able to do this kind of work and to compare apples to apples as best as possible across a big system. And so if I tell you that we partnered with an outside analytic firm to be able to do that, the firm being called Biome, you can see that we're able to put some numbers around this. And we asked our clinicians to look at their own behavior, to look in the mirror with each other, if you will, to get to a place of greater objectivity, to understand how we could bridge from the current level of clinical variation to a more integrated approach to certain questions, including in this case, how quickly we're extubating our patients after, by and large, routine CABGs. As you can see over time, and we've been in force with Bay Area-wide co-management less than a year, we're showing that we're moving the needle and able to move the needle in the right direction. Importantly, the shift in the direction of utilizing a common set of ideas, a common protocol that you execute on to get these patients off the blower sooner is not resulting in massively increased rates of reintubation or prolonged ICU stays. It's actually quite the reverse. And this was authored by the clinicians. And yes, it has a payout. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean that we are opening up access on the basis of this to other patients who need our services and are otherwise being turned away. We're saving 247, 248 bed days that otherwise we would be consuming because we were unwilling to take an objective look in the mirror at how we were doing things and spread good ideas and adhere to those good ideas and iteratively try to improve them. And yes, there are cost savings associated with this, and again, I need not belabor why that's important. Well, if you look at acute kidney injury after percutaneous coronary intervention, same idea. I think this is something that in our system was flying below the radar for a long time. While we were focused on, bright and shiny things, other whats that we thought were more important, we weren't focusing on some of the less important whats that, however, have an impact on our patients and how well they do and on the viability of our system. And so looking at, again, developing a protocol to try and address that. We identified this as a target of achievement in the originally piloted experience with co-management at the one institution that I was operating at before, and that is Institution C, Hospital C there, which you can see has had a bit of a head start in working on this. But by sharing merely that protocol across systems and incentivizing people to align around that, what you see is rolling four-quarter improvement in our O to E rates, and this is just two quarters. We're 2 quarters in arrear in terms of our data. We've got to solve that gap. We want to get to a point where we're a little bit more real time. But already in the earliest experience of this Bay Area-wide cardiovascular co-management targeting this, we've achieved notable gains in almost all of our hospitals. And I believe the forthcoming data will look even better across the system. Again, we're opening up 117 days in those first 2 quarters alone of access for patients who need it, not just for cardiovascular indications, but for all others. And there is a cost savings associated with it, which redounds to the efficiency component of quality of care. So I spent a lot of time, and I'm going to wrap up now, I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of teams and their roles in helping to create cultures that incentivize us to take an objective look at ourselves individually and at the performance of our team overall. I've talked about the importance of aligning and enabling people to focus on performance to the extent possible. We've got a long way to go. It's going to take more than just cardiovascular co-management to revolutionize care and push it in the direction of performance and not make it entirely bounded by production-based reimbursement and compensation. But the reality is that I think cardiovascular leaders and the interdisciplinary heart team shines a light on the right direction forward for not just cardiovascular care, but for the entire system. That said, I am a surgeon, and I have tremendous respect and admiration for the experience that I had in training, and I extend that to that of every other subspecialty. The idea that one should be accountable individually for their craft, for how they conduct themselves, for the way in which they commit themselves to the patient's best interest on every individual occasion need not and must not be abrogated because we're focusing on team-based performance. This was brought home to me when I was reading an article in the New York Times Sunday Magazine a few months ago now by a former pilot, crash site investigator, now turned journalist, who was writing about the recent tragedies associated with the Boeing 737 MAX problems. Early on in the article, which was an exhaustive, very well-written article, had a lot of technical detail in it, and I am not an aviator, so I can't pretend to be a master of that content. He invoked a concept that I thought was really important. It was important insofar as if we go back to my daddy's idea around team, which was Coach Lombardi's idea of individual initiative put to collective or put towards collective goals, the individual initiative part can't be lost. And so we are training our people in ways that in many ways are analogous to what is happening in the aviation industry, in stressed marketplaces, where algorithms and simulator-based training is de rigueur, but also the totality of the training experience. And I think something is being lost in that regard. And that's something he described as airmanship, and I'll just read this to you. Airmanship is an anachronistic word, but it is applied without prejudice to women as well as men. Its full meaning is difficult to convey. It includes a visceral sense of navigation, an operational understanding of weather and weather information, the ability to form mental maps of traffic flows, fluency in the nuance of radio communications, and especially a deep appreciation of the interplay between energy, inertia, and wings. Airplanes are living things. The best pilots do not sit in cockpits so much as strap them on. Unless they make extraordinary efforts, they may never develop true airmanship, no matter the length of their careers. The worst of them are intimidated by their airplanes and remain so until they retire or die. It is unfortunate that those who die in the cockpits tend to take their passengers with them. Now, I think an operating room, a hybrid room, a cath lab, an ER, an ICU, a boardroom, they're like cockpits. The people who inhabit them need to animate them as individuals, but then offer that individuality to one another to compose teams that are higher performing. And so I think just as there is airmanship in aviation, there's airmanship in healthcare integration. And I won't go through all of the analogs here. I'll let you just look at them if you like. But I do think there's an internal compass that we need to help guide people through the care experience. I do think there are dynamic interplays between market forces and malalignments structurally of incentives that we need to solve for. I think we have to have a sensitivity to the toll gates people have to move through in order to get their care and have their issues resolved. I think we need a clarity of focus in terms of the way in which we communicate and the form that those communications take and the regularity with which they occur. And I think we need to have a deep understanding and commitment to resolving any misalignments around the interplay between resources, incentives, and visions. If we can do this, we can scale up the effects of what I think has been a very proud moment for cardiovascular specialists and their leadership, which is the interdisciplinary team-based care concept that I believe we should be so devoted to. So I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas with you. I hope sucking in perspectives from outside of healthcare hasn't been a bore or a distraction. And I just wanted to take the chance because it has been important to me and to our teams. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vial. That was a really fantastic talk. Do we have questions for Dr. Vial? Yes, please.
Dr. Vial, thank you for your great perspective, much needed for physicians to kind of embrace these things. As much as the concepts of integrated care and multidisciplinary teams have been brought to forefront by the ischemic teams and valve team, we've been doing this in transplant for decades.
Yes.
And when you look at, and I've been doing this for a decade with our surgeons, it takes an army of people and an army of dedication to do this. And I believe and I feel like the only reason it's sustained in transplantation is because transplantation as a program has been given a high pedestal for cost, for accountability,
Yes.
for the risk of program shutting down. So we've invested in it.
Yes.
When you extrapolate that to the rest of it, I'm told TAVR doesn't make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go to general heart failure, I'm still trying to figure out how to pay for the 60-minute educator because you don't get paid for that. So how do you factor that big cost gap with all the best intentions that the healthcare system is not accounting for if we really want to do this the right way?
Right. Thank you for your question. I think the point that you make is a very compelling one, and it is important to acknowledge that a lot of this teamsmanship that I've been talking about has been ongoing in the transplant, above and below the diaphragm, solid and organ transplant experience, and frankly in oncology as well, when it's well practiced from a tumor board, interdisciplinary tumor board perspective. I think the way I would approach the answer to your question is that we have, again, because, and let me see if this works for you, because we as an industry, as a discipline, and I mean healthcare with a capital H here, have focused very much on what rather than how. We've been very focused on production because you produce what's. And we've supported and invested in production. In so doing, we very quickly, from a business perspective, hop from production to growth. Growth in procedural volume, growth in lives served, growth in fill in the blank. Well, if you look at that from a profit loss perspective, we're looking at top line, and we're not caring about bottom line. We're not caring about whether we are as efficient as we can be in deserving growth because we're busy promoting growth. Well, we're at a point where the math on that doesn't work. In some places more than others. I will say we're in a very high stress area back at home. But that stress, if you do the math and roll it forward, really a brief instant, is going to come to apply everywhere. And so the idea here, and the reason that I'm so insistent on including efficiency as an element of clinical quality, because I believe that's what it is we need to start looking at how we waste less with equal intensity to how we consume more or produce more. And the investment has to be rationalized not always on the basis of top-line growth. The investment has to be rationalized on limiting bottom-line losses. Because in the end, what matters is margin for sustainability and for value creation. And I mean clinical value, not just economic value. So I think that's really the approach that we need to take to this. It's difficult because we have malaligned compensation schemes in many instances. And we don't have a safe space for people to come together and look in the mirror together because everybody's competing with everybody. And they are incentivized to an extreme extent to do so. And to some extent, transplant has been able to escape that because there have been bundled payments, for example, in transplant since the beginning. It's not a per-click reimbursement. It's how well did you do on the totality of the care delivery. So I think it's an important comparison that you make, and I thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you for coming. Obviously, we share many challenges in this field altogether. The question to you is, you mentioned incentives several times, and I know individuals or healthcare systems incentivize in different ways towards a common goal, particularly that is not tangible, and particularly that at times it's conflicting for the provider as well as the healthcare system. How do you incentivize?
So I've illustrated the co-management construct, and by the way, there are many iterations on that. You know, I could get into the nuts and bolts in that. I didn't think it was appropriate, and we wouldn't have time for it. I illustrated that as a means of, in a sense, decoupling or recoupling to the fundamental, the core economic reality, which is there's production-based reimbursement. And that does not create incentives for people to work together or perhaps even individually to perform beyond the level of production. How do we make investments? How do we use the power of a system that is wanting to come together to invest in that togetherness by investing in and finding a licit and compliant way to promote, including with compensation, work that goes beyond production? I talk about performance beyond production. Co-management is a beginning, but we need much more systemic and organic change to really reach. And it doesn't apply everywhere. Again, we've utilized co-management. You know, I first became acquainted with it looking at focus function hospitals that orthopedic surgeons owned. That's not our circumstance. But how do we adapt that, and how do we not just make it a single specialty co-management, but an alignment across subspecialties? And it is working for us, but there's much more opportunity, even within this sector. That said, this is tied to our specialty and the segments of our specialty that express themselves in the acute care arena, which is why the hospital is contracting with the LLC. What about the ambulatory? And doesn't what happens in the ambulatory on the so-called upstream side, as well as the downstream side of an acute intervention, make a difference, not only for individuals, but for populations, if we're trying to save money and be more efficient, and yet push the quality of care upwards by reducing variation? So we haven't cracked this nut by any manner of means. This is just spotlighting something that we've done to go beyond or get out of the way of our own compensation mechanisms.
Conrad, great presentation. Let me see if I can pick your brain on a current implementation problem that we've got. On the one hand, we've got the best cardiology and CV surgery outcomes that we've ever had in this organization. And on the other hand, is we're talking about implementing virtual ICU across our system. And, you know, one approach is, why would we change anything since we finally figured out how to make the outcomes better? And the other is, this may be better, but it also may help cost reduction. In the face of coronavirus and potentially have an ICU filled with patients on ventilators seems brilliant right at the present time. So have you got any experience with this, maybe cardiovascular telehealth beyond the ICU? And how did you implement it?
Well, it sounds like we're at very similar places, because we are looking at and wanting to create, at least for our part of the world, a best practice in what we're referring to as EICU. Some of that is born out of coverage challenges, which perhaps you don't have here. But if you do, that can be an initial impetus for it. But as you say, it's got to be about something bigger than that. I'll tell you, it's early days for us. But immediately, what you realize, depending on how you run your ICUs, is that you've got to get really clear-eyed and have direct line of vision on who needs to be on the team. Our cardiovascular co-management has 100 cardiovascular specialists in the Bay, and there's a number amassing in the Valley as well, so we could reach the number of 200 easily. But it doesn't include pulmonary critical care specialists. It doesn't include nephrologists. So one of the things that's behind, you're focusing on EICU, but as we talk about even stuff in targets in the ambulatory arena, is it proper for us to be thinking exclusively about a cardiovascular service line? Or should we be thinking about a metabolic health service line? Because most of the people we take care of are hypertensive, dyslipidemic, hyperglycemic. And so the contributions of endocrinologists who work in the hospital or work in both the acute and ambulatory arenas, nephrologists certainly, alongside cardiologists, becomes important. Well, if you take that idea and you apply it to the patients who have critical care needs, who else needs to be on the team? And how can you create an incentivization for performance across those teams? Because it becomes even more difficult to start to try and create coalitions between not only cardiovascular experts, but non-cardiovascular experts, and yet that's what many places need. I don't know how you run your ICU, but certainly in our system, that's a challenge. We also need to look at some disciplines really at a medical staff credentialing and privileging level. Many of our hospitals have an open ICU. Do open ICUs drive the best quality outcomes, particularly in the sickest patients? And if they do, are they bounded by real credentialing criteria, or is it just if you're a member in good standing, you can admit to the ICU? So we get into all of that, but we're very early days. I would not want to delude you by thinking we've got that solved at all.
Again, thank you very much for a fantastic insight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.